The dust devil spun across the barren plains outside Redemption Canyon, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that smelled like endings. Jacob Collier sat on the wooden porch of his sprawling ranch house, watching the sun bleed red across the horizon. At 52 years old, with silver threading through his weathered beard and lines etched deep around his eyes, he'd made peace with the idea that passion had died in him years ago. That is, until Margaret Ashford walked into his life on a rain-soaked Tuesday in April. She'd arrived on the stage from Sacramento with nothing but a leather trunk and a marriage certificate signed 3 days before by his son, Thomas, a marriage that had shocked the entire territory. Margaret was beautiful, yes, but not in the delicate, porcelain way frontier society expected of wives. She was raw, untamed, with dark eyes that held secrets and a strength in her bearing that suggested she'd survived things most people couldn't imagine. At 28, she carried herself like someone who'd learned early that beauty alone wouldn't save her in this unforgiving land. "Father, I trust you'll make Margaret feel welcome," Thomas had said that first evening, his arm looped possessively around her waist. Jacob's son had always been weak, too refined to the West, too soft for ranch life. He'd married Margaret on impulse during a business trip, drawn to her mystery, but incapable of truly understanding her. The thought had crossed Jacob's mind then, fleeting but unmistakable. This won't last. Over the following weeks, Jacob tried to maintain distance, honoring the boundaries that decency demanded. He busied himself with cattle drives and mending fences, leaving the ranch during daylight hours and retiring early to his study. But proximity bred familiarity, and familiarity bred something far more dangerous than scandal. It began innocuously. Margaret appeared in the kitchen one morning while Jacob was pouring coffee, and they fell into conversation about the land itself, how it demanded respect, how it revealed character, how only certain souls could truly be a home in such vastness. She spoke with eloquence that surprised him, discussing philosophy and literature alongside practical observations about which water sources ran cleanest during drought. "You've read Whitman?" Jacob asked one afternoon, finding her alone on the porch with a worn copy of Leaves of Grass. "Cover to cover, 3 times, she replied, looking up with a slight smile. "Once in Boston, once in New Orleans, and once here, because I needed reminding that freedom existed outside these walls." Jacob sat beside her uninvited. "Where are you from, Margaret?" The real story, not the polite version. She closed the book slowly. "Why do you want to know?" "Because my son doesn't," he said quietly. "And because I think I recognize someone who's been hunted. I've done some hunting of my own." The vulnerability that crossed her face then was like watching someone lower a weapon. She told him everything. About her father's debts, the men who came to collect, the saloon owner who purchased her contract to settle what she couldn't pay. About Thomas, who'd seen her once and wanted to rescue her, without understanding that she'd already begun rescuing herself. About arriving at the Collier Ranch expecting imprisonment, but discovering instead a kind of golden prison, beautiful but no less confining. Does Thomas? Jacob struggled with how to ask. "He's kind," Margaret said carefully. "But kindness without understanding is just another form of captivity." The words hung between them like lightning about to strike. By summer, the attraction had become undeniable. It lived in the space between moments, in the way their hands would nearly touch while passing butter at dinner, in the charged silence when they met unexpectedly near the barn, in the electricity that crackled when their eyes met across a room. Jacob found himself inventing reasons to be wherever she was. He taught her to ride not because she needed instruction, but because he wanted her close. He began lingering in the main room in evenings when Thomas was occupied with ledgers. Margaret maintained a careful distance, but not impenetrable. She would laugh at his stories about early ranching days, would seek his opinion on what should be planted in the North Garden, would mention wanting to visit the falls and glance toward him as if hoping he might offer to guide her there. The confrontation came on a brutally hot afternoon in August when Thomas returned unexpectedly from town. He found them in the library, the two of them sitting with barely a foot between them, discussing a legal brief about property rights. There was nothing improper in the scene, yet everything about it screamed intimate familiarity. Thomas's face cycled through confusion, then comprehension, then something darker. "Father?" Jacob stood immediately, putting space between himself and Margaret. We were discussing the northwest section. "Don't," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "Don't insult me with lies. I've seen the way you look at her. I've watched you engineer situations to be near her. I've heard the tenderness in your voice." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Margaret remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. "You're right," Jacob said finally. The decision to tell the truth felt like stepping off a cliff. "You're right, and I'm sorry. But not for the reasons you think." Thomas laughed bitterly. "Not for the reasons. Father, you're 50 years old. My wife is your daughter-in-law. What possible reason justifies this?" "Because she's being suffocated," Jacob said, and now his voice carried the weight of years of silence. "Because you married her to rescue a damsel, but she's no damsel. She's a warrior, and warriors cannot be caged, not even kindly. And because somewhere in the last 3 months, I fell in love with her mind, her strength, her spirit. I fell in love with someone I shouldn't have, in a situation that's impossible, and I was content to feel that in silence until I died." Margaret's sharp intake of breath made both men turn toward her. She stood, and when she did, there was a kind of terrible grace in it. "This is not what I wanted," she said, looking between them. "Either of you. I came here to escape being defined by what men wanted from me, and I've walked straight into a different kind of entrapment." She turned to Thomas. "You married someone you didn't see, someone you wanted to need you. That's not love. That's possession dressed up in rescue." Thomas stepped back as if struck. Then she turned to Jacob, and her dark eyes were luminous with unshed tears. "And you, God help me, you see me. You've always seen me. But you see me as a man who could be my father. And even though your love might be true, it's built on the same foundation of protection and control. Neither of you want me. You want versions of me that fit into your lives." "That's not true," Jacob said roughly. "Margaret, Yes, it is," she interrupted. "And the worst part is that I love the idea of being loved by you. I love that you listened, that you understood. But I can't build a life on someone else's redemption arc." She left him there in the library, the sound of her footsteps climbing the stairs the loudest thing in the world. 3 days later, the stage took her away before dawn. She left a letter addressed to both Jacob and Thomas, explaining that she was going to San Francisco, where she had a position awaiting her as a teacher. She'd saved enough from an inheritance she'd never mentioned to buy her independence. She wrote that she would always be grateful to Jacob for seeing her, and to Thomas for giving her the chance to choose her own path. She asked them both to let her go, to understand that sometimes love meant setting someone free rather than binding them tighter. Jacob watched the dust settle behind the departing stage from the same porch where he'd first learned about passion, and he understood, finally, what real love meant. It meant wanting someone's happiness more than their presence. It meant accepting that some people you meet are meant to teach you, not to stay. Over the years that followed, he received occasional letters from Margaret, usually around Christmas. She'd established herself as a respected educator in San Francisco, had founded a school for girls who come from similar backgrounds, exploited, trafficked, desperate. She'd become precisely what she was meant to be, someone's savior, including her own. She never married, but she was never lonely. She lived fully, gorgeously, dangerously. Jacob eventually stepped back from the ranch, leaving it to Thomas, who eventually found a more suitable wife, a woman content with the role of rancher spouse. Jacob opened a school himself in the next territory over, dedicated to teaching young people about law and property rights, particularly for women. He never stopped missing Margaret, but the missing was clean and clear, untainted by regret, because he'd loved her enough to let her become herself. And somewhere in that act of release, Jacob Collier finally became the man he was always meant to be.